Welcome to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast. I've got Ben and Michael here, our co-MDs. Hello, guys.
Hey, Meg. How you doing?
Hi, Meg.
Yeah, all good, thank you. We're gearing towards Christmas, and it doesn't seem like it's slowing down, so it's been really busy on our end. And I think we can't wait for a little break, quite frankly. So let's dig into the stories, starting with one from Habiba at law.com. About why the climate protesters have been targeting A&O Shearman. So basically, she says, for everyone in the industry, you will have seen that various kind of climate groups have been protesting outside of various law firms in recent weeks. And A&O Shearman has been targeted, I think, 3 times in the last few weeks. So it's more than the others. And her piece kind of explores why that's the case. And as part of it, she says that actually some of the groups that she's spoken to have said that compared to the other Magic Circle firms that they've targeted before, they claim that A&O Shearman has not really been cooperative and really communicative with them, as opposed to, for example, Slaughter and May, I think she mentions, and Clifford Chance as well, who apparently have had meetings with these groups before, and, you know, as a result, they decided not to protest there as much. And that's why they're putting a lot more pressure on this firm in particular, because they've not had any responses. So I think that's just kind of interesting from, I guess, the comms point of view, because no firm so far has commented publicly. And to be honest, I don't think there's much to say. But what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think, look, people like to be listened to. They like to be heard. There's something to be said for engagement if somebody asks you to engage, even if it's difficult. And, you know, based on the piece, it seems to indicate that it's the lack of engagement, which is leading to A&O Shearman being targeted a bit more. I mean, let's be realistic. The actual carbon emissions of law firms themselves are tiny. You know, you've got some offices, you've got some people flying about the place to go to meetings. That's about it. It's indirect through the work that they do for energy companies, particularly if it's fossil fuel, traditional energy. And the reality is that we live in a world where if you tried to turn fossil fuels off tomorrow, people would die, people would starve, the world would shut down. You know, it's called an energy transition for a reason, right? It's going to take a long time. You know, it would be wrong, I think, for anybody to say that a perfectly legitimate company doing something in fossil fuels shouldn't be able to get legal advice on how it should comply with the law. And at the same time, you know, firms should consider how they frame their work in the context of an energy transition, and, you know, how the work enables that transition. And I think it is, you know, my advice would always be to at least be ready with your messaging if you are targeted for something like this, whether it's climate, whether it's human rights issues, whether it's something else where a big firm has got a particular exposure point. Being prepared is vital. Hopefully you don't need it, but if you are targeted to then go against the grain and sort of say nothing or not engage, you know, I don't know if it's entirely accurate, obviously, but, you know, my advice would always be to be ready to have some engagement and to have your messaging right if you do come under scrutiny, just as a matter of good risk planning and guarding your reputation.
Yeah, I go a little bit further than that. I think that big firms have generally got some quite good messaging in place around, you know, helping big companies go through energy transition. There's also the point, isn't there, that you want companies that fossil fuel companies or tobacco companies or, something controversial, big businesses, to have really good law firms working for them, for good, honest reason. And I've been a little bit frustrated. Certainly not singling out anybody here, least of all A&O Shearman, and a slight reticence of getting on the front foot with some of this messaging. And I do agree with Mike's point that, firms do need to be ready with something solid and convincing for when they're targeting, but I think they do when they don't as well. And I think it's all too easy just to go very, very quiet until you have to. I think it's braver and probably more sensible to actually push your energy transition related messaging out there, because that's what a lot of firms are doing. I mean, we've all been part of conversations where you are looking to describe who you act for as a firm, which clients reflect your values. So I think I would like to see firms being a bit more out there and proactive on this stuff, particularly when it involves companies that are perhaps a little bit controversial. So again, not singling out A&O Shearman, and I do think the fact they begin with A probably isn't that helpful, given the massively long list of those firms that are on that list from, I think, graded to graded F. There's millions of them. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of firms as well, there's a bit of a branding exercise around these particular practice areas that actually do trigger these types of responses from these types of groups, where a lot of firms, I think, still use the oil and gas practice or sector and that kind of stuff. And I think actually now we're at a point where pretty much every major economy is trying to transition. And I think it would be just better to kind of maybe rename those, energy transition practice areas, even though that still means you might still be, advising a big oil company, but actually, it won't just be on getting more oil. It will be about, trying to transition to something else. So it's really fascinating. I think a lot of firms, they've not come under scrutiny for that yet, but I think it will come at some point around their use of AI and how that's impacting the environment as well. I think that's coming personally, and I think they need to get ready around their response to that, because I think everyone's kind of jumping on the bandwagon on this, which is fine, but I think we're starting to see.
Do you mean the energy footprint?
Consumption,
The energy footprint of AI.
Using AI, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's an interesting one. I'm not certain, but people know as much as they perhaps could. I certainly don't claim to know as much as I should about it. But I know there is an energy cost to using AI, and I guess that becomes more intensive the more you're using it. So definitely something to think about. If for knowledge industries.
Yeah, there's a big difference as well, just on the broader point, isn't there, between, as I described a few minutes ago, of firms genuinely trying to create a client base which reflects their values and who they are in 2024, and oh my goodness, these are all the clients we act for. How on earth can we concoct some sort of narrative to justify it? And let's face it, the two types of conversation do happen.
Cool. Let's move on to the next story. So actually, the next one is it's another Lot.com one. It's around partner retention. So Molly published a piece this week quoting various law firm leaders around why what makes hires successful and what makes retention so successful. Some of these firms, their data showed that between 2020 and 2023, they had, the likes of 95% or more retention rates of their lateral partner hires. So it's a very interesting piece. Various kind of leaders are quoted in there, from Davis Polk, Paul Hastings, Gibson Dunn. There's quite a lot in there. It's funny because the responses obviously vary massively from firm to firm, because I think it's just very different business models. But between those saying, some people are saying that there's some of these firms actually don't hire much and kind of really hang on to these hires either because of culture or because of pay. It depends. it's kind of fascinating. A lot of people are actually quite critical of that and saying, no, that's not what's happening, and actually it's something completely different. It's the type of work that they're doing, etc. So yeah, various reasons in that piece. It's a very long piece, worth a read. Did you guys have any particular thoughts on this?
I mean, I thought it was an interesting piece. Obviously, it's the kind of thing that, large law firms or law firms of any size, making a lateral partner hire is a big investment, and a huge amount of work and effort goes into getting the process right. So obviously, when it doesn't work out, there is a degree of soul searching, I think, as to, the process, because it's not only very time consuming, but it's expensive. And I don't, and I think there is an appreciation that, nobody does it just organically anymore. The vast majority or a large majority of growth or progress might come from it, but you do need to have almost as bringing new ideas, bringing fresh thinking, bring it as well as the revenues. I think lateral hires play a vital role, but getting them mostly right is also crucial. I did like the article. I thought it was quite a good exploration of different areas. I think culture is probably important, but it's, the comment about, prospective hires looking for three things: decent pay, a strong brand and platform, and people who aren't arseholes. There's no reason why it shouldn't be as simple as that. I mean, I think that's, hits the nail on the head, but also people do want to join firms that are growing and going places. There is that aspirational point. So I think if you join a firm because of you've been sold on the growth and the growth potential, and you're bought into that, and that is what's happening, then you're probably more likely to stay. I think when you get a disconnect between the promises and the promises made by the firm and the expectations, and what actually happens, somebody's less likely to stay. In the same way that if a partner who's joining makes certain promises and commitments and then doesn't deliver on them, again, it's probably not likely to work out. So having that things in sync between the promises and commitments made and then following through on them, whether it's on the firm side or the individual partner side, seems to be vital. And when you get the disconnect, that's when it doesn't work.
Yeah, I would add to that, though. I remember sort of midway through my time at Slaughter May, speaking to one of the senior partners there and asking about the famed lack of lateral hiring history. And he said to me, it's not for any reason to do with culture or mystique or any of those typical Slaughters things. It's more to the fact that the percentage of lateral hires that don't work out is just too high to take the risk. And he said to me that I think he's seen some data where the number of significant big lateral hires that had lasted less than 3 years before the individual moved on was really, really high, and much higher than you'd think. And I won't name the person, but I am minded of a very senior corporate partner who's moved, I think, from a Magic Circle firm to the same US firm twice, in two different times, and a Silver Circle firm in the space of probably less than a decade. I'm sure that's just an outlier, but I think there's more movement than you might think. And maybe it's just precarious, right? Doing a lateral move, and you're not as plug and play as you otherwise might think. I'm not sure, but of course some do really, really work out. But I think the number that don't, where people go, is quite significant, and there are reasons for that. Every firm culturally is very, very different. And I've worked in four, and they're very, very different places, and you don't, what works in one doesn't necessarily work in the other, and you just might be seeing that playing out at a partner level. It could be as simple as that.
Yeah, and I think also, back to your point, Michael, around investment, yeah, it's a huge investment for firms. I think it's also equally a really big investment on equity partners in particular, obviously, to join a new firm for quite a while. So I think initially people just want to make it work, right, for everyone's sake. But I think it's interesting to me that the point about the legal press kind of, when there's a departure story, it's often really negative. And sometimes I'm just thinking, I mean, sometimes it's justified and it makes sense and there's a clear narrative that you can understand why that's happening. But sometimes I'm just thinking, actually, it's okay. Like people come and go, and sometimes it just doesn't work out for whatever reason, or maybe your priorities as a lawyer kind of might change. Um, and I think that's fine. And I think sometimes it's a bit dramatized, the way it's played out in the press. And and to be honest, I've been at the front line of that, writing these types of stories before, and I'm not throwing any kind of like digs at anybody. It's just kind of interesting to me the fact that a departure is automatically framed as something really negative when sometimes actually, sometimes you do get firms where some partners are there for a really long time and actually haven't billed for the last 10 years because they've been in a management position, and actually that's costing a lot to the business. So I think it's interesting to me to always put it in a negative thing when sometimes it's not necessarily that way. Sometimes it's actually needed for business reasons, or it doesn't have to be framed this way. And I think it's more complex, and I think a lot of the time there's always a push and pull factor. It's not always a team leaving because they're unhappy or whatever. It might be the case, but I actually think often the firm also has something to say, and vice versa. Sometimes,
Yeah, it's about controlling. It's about
yeah,
controlling the narrative. I think it's
completely.
about controlling the narrative around when things either don't work or when things come to a natural conclusion. Partnerships evolve, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes a firm that didn't have a lot of lateral hires shifts to having a lot of lateral hires, or has a generational shift or change.
yeah,
And, a number of people will retire at similar times. You get some fresh energy coming in. Sometimes that isn't already in the firm. If you don't have it coming through the ranks, you buy it in. And equally, there'll be other times when a firm might divest of certain areas of business. It might focus on it might decide that a particular area, private client or whatever, isn't necessarily a strategic focus. And in which case, they may have invested some money in it before, but then if there's a strategic decision but it's not a priority, then clearly people are gonna leave. And it's about
yeah,
controlling that narrative, so that it isn't misinterpreted as bad news.
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, completely.
I agree. And just going back to the piece and some of the percentages in there, it's not necessarily to apples and pears. They talk about Cravath, which has got quite a small partnership compared to some other firms who are, who've got several hundred numbers of partners, and clearly, a number of those won't work out. The bigger the firm gets, the more of these you will get, just with the law of averages, really, I think.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next. Again, it's this one is from the lawyer. It's from Rachel at the lawyer. Um, Basically, it's a story around training contracts. Again, it's interesting the way reading these stories, and it's not just the lawyer; it's across the legal press around kind of the figures and how there's an emphasis on the figures themselves and what they speak to, and basically the piece just talks about how unshockingly U.S. firms in the UK tend to have much less trainees than Magic Circle firms or some international firms that have been here a long time do. And it kind of explores that a little bit more. Interesting piece. I'm keen to
Yeah,
hear your thoughts first, actually, Ben. Do you want to go ahead?
yeah, definitely. I think that the experience of being a trainee at a US firm here in London is just so different to being in the Magic Circle. If I can reference my former employer again, Silver May, with 100 partners or so in London, had 80 trainees a year. That's huge. Two cohorts of 40. And if you take I think in Rachel's piece, it talked about some firms, including Millbank. Millbank, I think about 60 partners here. They take on sort of 11, 12 trainees a year. You just have to do the maths, and it shows you that it's a very different experience. I think you get a lot more partner time and hands-on time at a US firm than naturally you would at a UK firm. But the training infrastructure in UK firms is very old and well established. There's huge graduate recruitment teams, and lots of different levels of support. So you probably get a much more institutional experience at a Magic Circle firm than you do in a US firm. I think it's probably, completely different.
It used to drive me insane when the press would do, legal press would look at retention numbers. And when I was at HSF, or Herbert Smith as was at the time, and when you're at a firm that's got 60 or 70 trainees, and your retention numbers dip a little bit for whatever reason, and it gets reported back, only 79%, and then you see a US firm, a Davis Polk, 100% retention rate again, and it's like, yeah, there's only 4 trainees though. It's kind of a hell of a lot easier, just as a numbers game. If you've got single figure number of trainees, it's quite significant if you don't hang on to all of them. Whereas if you're talking about 50, 60, 70, 80, you're not everybody's going to work out. It's just isn't. So the laws of, statistically, the laws around small numbers are very different from the laws around bigger numbers. So that was, and I suspect that continues to be quite irritating. But I do think that there has been a bit of a sea change in terms of how more of the US firms now are taking on trainees, and they're taking on more trainees. They're prioritizing growing their own a bit more, which I think is a mark of, as their offices, which many of them have grown very fast over the past decade or so, starting to mature. And also, I think the UK firms probably feel a little bit sore to some extent at having really carried the financial load of training a vast majority of people, many of whom don't go on many of whom don't stay and go on elsewhere, including the US firms. But equally, some of that will be because they've not been given the right opportunities. It's not just about the salaries. It's also, you may get that much more partner time. Once you're qualified, it might be very attractive to go to US firm, not just because of the salary. But I can understand the sort of magic circle feeling a little bit like they carry the costs of the training burden for which is probably disproportionate, I would say, over the last decade or so. When you think about how those people that were trained in magic circle firms have since scattered around the market.
Yeah, and I just go back to my first point about being such a different experience. I'm always minded to think of Jones Day, who are quite firm in terms of their profile. But when you're a trainee there, I think this is still right, because I asked somebody recently, you don't have seats. You're expected to go out and find your own work from across the firm. And how different is that than, having a seat in corporate, a seat in litigation, deciding where to qualify? It's a completely different experience, I think. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I think it's interesting.
I agree, and I think it's, to me, again, it's interesting that a lot of the journalists out there reporting on these things often focus a bit too much on the figures, and they're like, oh, well, what does it mean? And obviously having higher figures is obviously positive, and it's like, well, not necessarily, because it just shows you that there's a different need, that there's a different demand, and that the business that you're looking at is operating in a very different way, and that the mindset is not the same. It doesn't mean one is better than the other. It just means that it's a very different operation, and that's okay. And I think it doesn't look too much into the actual benefits and challenges that they might face at either types of firms, and the experience that they actually get, and the kind of how, when they qualify, who's had a more comprehensive kind of training, and I think it's really interesting that these questions are not really thought of at the moment, and I think there would be really interesting messaging around that too, anyway, for all of these firms. So it's fascinating to me, the obsession with the figures, and then that's the layer that decides everything else. So yeah, it's fascinating to watch. And I think the last story of the day, came out. Well, it's been ongoing for a while. Obviously, it's the Kramer Levin Paris office. So for those who've not caught up in the last few weeks, obviously there's a merger going on with HSF, and Kramer Levin has decided as a result to kind of cut off their Paris operation. So that entire team is currently expecting to not have a firm anymore unless someone else comes in and kind of takes them in. Alex Taylor reported earlier this week that Morgan Lewis was the top contender among other U.S. firms to potentially take that team. I think the team, let me check the figures. I think there is the Kramer Levin Paris office houses 19 partners and has a total headcount of 63 people. So yeah, interesting. There's lots of movements in Paris as a result of that. Ben, do you want to start?
Yeah, clear that Paris is a big market, isn't it? And Alex is very obviously well connected on the ground there. As he is across Europe, and there's been a number of stories and rumours of big plays by US firms across this year. We saw Paul Hastings take on a boutique. There've been other significant deals as well. Paris is absolutely in the market to watch. So it seems a bit counterintuitive actually that a US firm is looking to dispose of its Paris offer, and some of the firms that have been linked with Kramer's Paris outfit are big, and some that we know were linked and haven't been mentioned are also significant. And we're going to do predictions at the end, aren't we? But it really does feel as if Paris is significant. And what's interesting, actually, from a geopolitical perspective, is the carnage. Sorry, Meg, I know it's a bit close to home, but the
No, that's
political
okay.
I don't want to upset you live on air, but the
No,
political.
I'm not upset. Nobody's upset about it in France. Don't worry. That's just routine for us.
Yeah, I get it. But the political carnage and uncertainty, which is clearly going on in France, doesn't really seem to be affecting that mood that Paris is a coming market again, and there does really seem to be a bit of detachment between political uncertainty, doesn't there, and what law firms do. I think you can even look at the UK. We don't want to get into a party political broadcast, but certainly some of Labour's business agenda has not been massively well received by the big corporate community. That doesn't really seem to stop US firms growing here at pace. So, all eyes on Paris.
Yeah, I think you've seen Ropes and Grey, I think, in the last couple of months. Bracewell launching in Paris. I'm not sure if there are others. And I think there wasn't really much crossover between Kramer Levin and HSF's footprint geographically, with the exception of Paris, where there probably is a bit too much crossover. So, and it's a very different market, and I think it's the case that in Paris it's a bit like barristers here, in that everybody's technically self-employed but working through a firm. So it's quite a sort of go your own way. Yes, it's collaborative, but in a different way, and a bit more of an individualistic legal market. So I guess if the synergies of joining in weren't really clear, it would make sense why the office would want to go somewhere else. And yeah, we'll see. Morgan Lewis might make sense. I guess we'll find out in the next few weeks. But I completely agree that Paris seems to be red hot at the moment in 2024, and probably will continue to be in 2025, political chaos notwithstanding.
Honestly, I think it's the place to be, and I know I'm biased, but I really do think it's the place to be. I wish it was the kind of place where we would host the Olympics forever. Like, this has been like 2023 and 2024 have been such a great year for Paris. And I think, it really is the place to be. And I think I saw, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Byfield Paris office, Meg Tilley.
Yeah, and I think, at the IBA last year, we had, everyone was saying, like, this is the place to be. Like, everyone was buzzing. So I think, it's interesting. Yeah, the political chaos and uncertainty doesn't seem to be really, like, targeting the markets very much. This morning, Lotocom was reporting that, lawyers are expecting some M&A activity in France next year, so they don't seem to be too worried for now. I mean, I guess if the uncertainty continues well into next year, then that's going to be a different story. But right now, they don't seem to be too worried. I think it's very much the French way of, that meme where you've got like fire everywhere and the dog's like everything's fine. I think that's kind of the French way, especially
Yeah.
the Parisian way. I think that's
Definitely.
very much what people how people react to these things. So yeah, we'll see. It's a fun yeah, it's a fun place to be. So everyone go to Paris.
Yeah, there's one other point though, isn't there? We talk about transactions, but Paris is a significant centre for disputes, isn't it?
Yeah.
On a number of levels, and Gus and Dina, who lead our disputes team, often talk about Paris as a really interesting market, and some of their work touches there, and they talk that it's a coming place. I mean, we like to think here that we are the kind of world centre of disputes in London, don't we? But I think Paris has a lot going for it.
And I think just even on the white collar side, I think there's been a lot of movement recently, especially towards politicians in Paris. So I think it's just really interesting, and I think it deserves a bit more attention for sure. Cool. Is there anything else you guys wanted to add for today's podcast?
Well, I think we were going to just do some quick predictions for 2025.
Yes, correct.
So, I suppose if we take one on the sort of, I think the focus on one on the positive side, one on the not so positive side. I think that the market consolidation and mergers will continue to gather some pace in 2025. I think it's inevitable. I think we will see the expansion of or creation of more transatlantic firms in particular, because frankly, it is fundamentally the US UK axis that is driving things. And whether it's nothing is permanent, but that's where the action's going to be. And so there are a number of firms that seem to be on the cusp of doing something. A number of other firms that are definitely in the market to do something, and a handful of firms that probably need to do something. So put all that together. Is it going to be a crushing rate wave of dozens and dozens of mergers? No, but will there be we'll be having this conversation in a year's time, looking back and thinking, yeah, there's been 3 or 4 or 5 big changes. Yes, I think it's inevitable. So that would be one pretty obvious forecast. And then if we go back to that climate conversation, I think ESG, but not necessarily the climate component, but I think the varying forms of ESG related issues and pressure will continue on firms. I think it'll, or on the profession, not more widely. I think in the UK, the Legal Services Board has got an initiative in the new year where they're going to put out some proposals around ethical behaviour by lawyers. Whether that creates some kind of positive duty or not, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I think people kind of forget about the G in ESG, and governance is important, right? And it's really important for law firms. And it's kind of weird how big the sector is now and how advanced, but there is very little by way of guidance and standards around how law firms should run themselves relative to other, big businesses. And yet most big reputational issues, whether it's a conduct issue, whether it's something else, where you get real contamination in the business is because there's governance failures, and that applies in the legal sector just as much. And so I think there will be a continued focus on ESG, whether that takes the form as an acceleration of like the focus on climate, or whether it is looking at more at the S and the G, I don't know. But I think firms should continue to think about difficult scenarios where they might come under pressure, and some aspects of ESG will I think create some significant reputational pressures in the legal sector.
So if it's my turn, the first thing I predicted last year was that Arsenal would win the Premier League, and Arsenal didn't win the Premier League, doing our customary choke at the end. So I'm going to confidently predict that Arsenal will not win the Premier League come May, and hopefully Man City seem to have completely fallen away. Hopefully Liverpool's amazing run under their new manager will stutter, and we'll be glimpsing into the sunlight of a first league win in 20 years or whatever it might be. However, back to the sector, I'm not as close to the markets in Asia as I am to the ones in the States, but I do look at what's going on in China with slight disbelief. I think last week it was announced that there were 14 firms that withdraw from Beijing this year, or even less time, and you've got whatever's going to come under Trump's leadership and trade wars and tariffs and things. And I think that whatever the Chinese market looks like this time next year will be very different from what it looks like now. Like I say, it's not a particular area of focus for me, but my eyes are always drawn to dramatic stories in China. One thing I do see actually, which I do want to spend a bit of time talking about, which I find fascinating, is looking at the big European markets that aren't London, particularly Paris and increasingly Milan. Looking at the not so much the relationship, but how the really, really good independent firms operate in those markets, sort of define themselves against US competitors, because increasingly in those markets, US firms, as we've already seen on the podcast in Paris, are staffing up. Yet the local firms rely on referrals from those firms as well in the US, and the relationships between those independent firms and their US competitors, I think, will be really, really interesting. I mean, we've talked about Paris. Like, there are 3 or 4 really, really good independent firms there, aren't there? Sheed, Bread and Pratt, etc. What are they going to look like in a year's time? How are they going to respond to the increasing attention of the US in those markets? Will they regard those other firms as friends from a referrals perspective, or foes in terms of taking their people and their clients? I've really got an eye on that. And I think next year will be particularly interesting. So those are my two predictions for next year. The final one, though, closer to home, is we're absolutely seeing a lot of movement, aren't we, in the comms teams in big firms. We've seen a lot of people move in the last few weeks, and a lot more to come. So I think there'll be a lot of change in comms teams in big firms next year. So some big names will go to big names in terms of firms. So yeah, watch this space.
Anything from you, Meg, in terms of predictions?
I think for me, because I don't want to. The crystal ball is not really my friend, but I do think it's going to be interesting in the first half of the year in 2025. I think all eyes will be on the US, because obviously Trump coming back into power, and some of the appointments that he's made, clearly I think on the business side it's going to be quite aggressive, the way things are going to change. But I think nobody really understands or knows yet what that's going to look like. And I think whatever happens in the US will trigger a lot of work for regulatory lawyers, in particular, across Europe. So I think that should be interesting. I don't know how that's going to impact deal activity worldwide. We'll have to see, but for sure, I think a lot of, especially Europe more than UK, but I think the UK will be impacted too. But I think anything related to kind of tech regulation, competition, and things like that, I think that's probably gonna be really busy next year. So yeah, I'm kind of curious to see, in a weird kind of way. So I think that's probably the only thing I can think of right now. It's really uncertain. So yeah, I'm not really sure what else to predict, but we shall see after the Christmas break. It's going to come quick.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, I think it's going to be another interesting year in 2025. It always is, when New Year comes around. But
quarter
yeah,
of a century as well in the first and the second millennium.
Quarter century. We're getting older.
I think some of the we definitely are. And from what I hear, some of the numbers, the UK revenues of big US firms here are going to be massive, which we'll start to see in January, February time, record years again. But I think from what I hear, like record years again with bells and whistles on. So quite what that means, I'm not so sure.
Well,
but big numbers coming.
Look, we're a big fan of big numbers in big law. It's fantastic to, in our own way, be supporting and part of the success of clients, and we want the industry to do well, right?
Absolutely. It seems there it is.
Great.
Good.
Cool. Well, thank you both for joining me this week. We'll be back, I guess, next week for another episode, and that's probably going to be the last one, actually, next week for 2024. So yeah, make sure to tune in. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week. We'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.